Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I found in my travels. Today, I want to talk about a book that I read, one that is kind of part of a series, but also not really. It's more of a prologue that was actually published first, without the author kind of realizing it until they started talking about the sequels. I am referring to a book that is about dwarves and dragons. It is The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien, which was published in 1937. For those who don't know it, I have a feeling a lot of people know who Tolkien is, either having read the books that he has written or even, watch the movies that are associated with the stuff that he's written. But J.R.R. Tolkien was a writer who lived in the 1900s. He was known for writing primarily fantasy. One of his first books was The Hobbit, which if I read correctly, or if I have my knowledge is correct, was mainly a bedtime story for his son Christopher before he ultimately decided to write it down. And that appeared to be a standalone story, and then flash forward about 20 years into the future when Tolkien had published the Lord of the Rings series. What's interesting is that this is sort of the second edition that I'm reading. In the first edition, there was a different interaction between Bilbo and Gollum in the story, where Gollum just sent Bilbo happily on his way. But when he revised it, he was thinking of the Lord of the Rings series, so he wanted to connect the two there. Which I find to be very interesting, how he would completely change the ending, or not the ending, but a large part of his book, in order to make it connect to something he was writing in the future. But, it's his story, so I guess he's free to do whatever he wishes with it. And yeah, so that's really Tolkien, largely viewed as a big deal in the fantasy community. While not relying on tropes themselves, he straight up created some mythos for lore about dwarves and elves and hobbits and humans and whatnot. So yeah, I had actually read the Lord of the Rings series before. About 2 years ago now, and I really loved it, and I wanted to check out The Hobbit. Did I enjoy it? Watch along to find out. I'm going to talk about The Hobbit here. I'll do a little bit of summary, do an analysis, and we will move on from there. So The Hobbit focuses primarily on Bilbo Baggins. He is a Hobbiton hobbit, living in Bag End, and he doesn't really aspire to do much else besides relax. And this is kind of highlighted when he's asked by a wizard named Gandalf to go on a quest to hunt down some gold and whatnot. And Bilbo says, go away, I don't want to talk to you about this. But he later agrees to meet with Gandalf about this quest that he's going on. And a short while later, at Bilbo's home, a bunch of dwarves show up. And the dwarves are like, we want you to burgle into under the Lonely Mountain, which is where Thorin, the head dwarf, that used to be his kingdom, his family's kingdom. But since it kind of fell and everything, a dragon named Smaug has taken it over and taken over much of the gold with it. And so they want to basically get rid of Smaug and also get the gold in the process, which Bilbo is a bit hesitant to do, but he ultimately agrees to it. Once they begin the journey, Bilbo encounters some problems with trolls, but thanks to Gandalf and Bilbo, they manage to keep the trolls talking long enough so that they turn to stone in the sun. They make their way through Rivendell and encounter Elrond, the head elf, and they even go to the Misty Mountains, where they encounter goblins that wish to do them harm. Luckily, Bilbo manages to find himself into the cave system, and he stumbles upon a mysterious creature named Gollum, who seeks to do him harm, but Bilbo challenges him to a game of riddles, which Gollum agrees to because he seems to like riddles. In the process, Bilbo encounters a magical ring that allows him to be invisible and manages to escape from both the goblins and Gollum in the process. But not too far away, they encounter more goblins and wargs, which are their big dog monsters that the goblins use to hunt down people. And it looks like they are about to be defeated, but luckily the eagles show up, pick them up, take them away, and basically carry them off to Mirkwood Forest, highlighting that they don't really want to go any further because they think that the humans will most likely try to kill them, which sounds about right. But that means that Bilbo and the dwarves are stuck in Mirkwood Forest, a very kind of scary place. Gandalf has gone off on his own at this point, hunting down a necromancer of sorts, which I think is somewhat connected to Sauron in the Lord of the Rings series. And they encounter a bunch of spiders, which Bilbo manages to fight off using his sword called Sting. But unfortunately, an elven king who lives in Mirkwood decides that the dwarves and Bilbo have caused too much trouble, so he imprisons the dwarves. He can't find Bilbo because he put the ring on and he's invisible now. And Bilbo manages to find a way to free all the dwarves and get them to sail down the river in barrels, which is interesting, and they finally arrive in Lake Town. The people of Lake Town are a bit wary of Bilbo and the dwarves, noting that they likely escaped from the Elf King because word got down to them. But they tell Bilbo and his gang to go up to the mountain. They don't mind because they think in all likelihood Smaug is going to kill them and be done with it. And indeed, when they get there, Bilbo encounters Smaug, who is upset that he's trying to steal some gold from him. As Tolkien notes, like Smaug is as upset as like a rich person would be if he tried to take something they weren't actually using in the first place, which I think is a fun bit of commentary there. And Smaug gets so angry in the process that he just straight up flies out, seals the dwarves and Bilbo inside the Lonely Mountain, and then attempts to kill people in Lake Town for aiding Bilbo and the gang. But luckily, a man named Bard and the Lake Town people manage to defeat Smaug, and Bard is viewed as a hero in the process. And because they know that the Lonely Mountain is now unguarded, they march there to claim part of their prize to help rebuild Lake Town. But when they get there, Thorin is deeply upset that anyone else would try to claim this gold. And it's assumed that a fight is about to take place. And so Bilbo decides to take the Arkenstone to Bard and say, this is my share of the treasure, you can have it, let's just end this fight here so that nothing bad happens. But before everyone can go away, and before Thorin can approve it, who's actually very angry and is very frustrated with Bilbo at this point, the Battle of the Five Armies takes place between the humans and the elves and the dwarves and the goblins and who knows what else. And Bilbo accidentally gets knocked out at the beginning of this battle. But luckily, the dwarves end up defeating the goblins. However, Thorin is mortally wounded and dies, but not before apologizing to Bilbo for the way that he treated Bilbo, who acted like a hero. After Thorin dies, they all decide to split the money, and Bilbo gets a pretty hefty share and is widely regarded as a hero among the dwarves and the people of Lake Town. And he sets about returning to Hobbiton, where he decides to relax for the rest of his days. And it's implied that the people of Bag End view him as somewhat of an oddity, and he doesn't really care about that. He's happy with his adventure, and the people are just going to have to deal with it, and that's where the story ends there. In terms of analysis, there is a fair bit to talk about here, although not as much as I thought there would be, because with the Lord of the Rings series, there was quite a lot to talk about, even within just one one version of the 6-volume kind of installment, because each book had 2 volumes. There was a lot worth talking about, but here there's not as much to talk about for some reason. But there are a couple of ideas that Tolkien does touch upon. The first is that of the hero's journey. Like Joseph Campbell with his idea of the hero with 1,000 faces, or even just the traditional story of adventure. Tolkien is borrowing heavily from that to tell his story here. Bilbo goes on the classic adventure. There's the call to adventure where Gandalf shows up and says, "Hey, do you want to help us steal some treasure from a dumb dragon?" And there's that hesitation that shows up in any classic adventure story, like, "Oh no, this is going to disrupt my life too much." And Bilbo feels that, but he quickly changes his mind, which I do think is a weakness of this story. Like, it doesn't take much for Bilbo to change his mind, and it doesn't really seem like they do a whole lot of convincing otherwise. So it's just like Bilbo says no, and then Bilbo says yes. I wish there was more there. And there's kings and royalty and dealing with dragons and beasts and trolls and monsters and all kinds of stuff like that. And ultimately, once Bilbo helps save the day, which he doesn't really do, like he does help fight against the trolls and other such things, but during the big battle, he is knocked out, and everyone else fights the battle on his behalf. And so, like, he doesn't really do a whole lot to save the day. And so even though he's the hero, the protagonist of this story, like, he doesn't get to do the climactic battle thing where he risks his life to save his friends, which I think is a bit weird. And then after that, he makes his return. And there's always that hesitancy to fully return, because you've been changed by your adventure, and you're no longer the person you once were, so everything is unfamiliar in your hometown. And indeed, that's what happens to Bilbo. He returns home a bit changed, a bit confused about about life. He doesn't really recognize people anymore. There's a good quote that I would like to read to you from this. "He was in fact held by all the hobbits of the neighborhood to be queer, except by his nephews and nieces on the Took side, but even they were not encouraged in their friendship by their elders." Which I find to be a really interesting quote, because it's once he goes on this journey, like people like the dwarves, the elves, the wizards, they all view him as a friend, but the people of his town view him as quite different. As there might be some people in the town who are like, "Oh, he's a good person," but no one's encouraged to be friends with Bilbo because he left. He went on this adventure, and he's kind of an oddity in this town where nobody really does adventurous things. And I think that's a really interesting quote, like the idea of you can't return home. Like if you go on a big quest, you're no longer the person you once were. And so like returning home is going to feel unfamiliar to you. And indeed, that's what happens to Bilbo. And I like how Tolkien gets at that in this story. Tolkien also relies on classic fantasy tropes in The Hobbit. He talks about goblins and adventures and elves and dwarves and trolls and necromancers and all kinds of creatures like that have already been established in folklore, and he brings them all together. But he doesn't seem to do it in a way that is as powerful or as different as what would happen in the Lord of the Rings series, because here it just seems like he's telling a story with these types of creatures in a way that was probably already done a couple times before. Not necessarily bad, but not anything groundbreaking in my opinion. But in the Lord of the Rings series, he did all of that, but he told a very interesting, like, good versus evil type of story, with like the elves being kind of racist dunderheads, the dwarves having their own problems, like Gandalf not really foreseeing any of this becoming a problem, and the hobbits being more pure of heart than anything else. And you don't really see any of that in this story. There's like 300 pages in the Kindle version I have, but Tolkien doesn't really seem to do anything with these fantasy tropes beyond simply tell a story that might have already been told before. Well, maybe not in this manner, but he certainly doesn't give any life to Middle Earth much in the same way that he did with the Lord of the Rings series. So that's unfortunate. But it is interesting to see him, even in 1937, playing with these fantasy tropes. And there are a couple of problems with the story. It does lack excitement at times. I found myself being very bored throughout parts of the book. Like even when the parts that were supposed to be exciting, like it didn't feel like there was enough jazz happening. Not enough cool things. Like the part with Smaug is there and then it's done. I would have liked to seen more there. And then there's a battle of 5 armies, but there's not a chance for much conflict between the dwarves and the humans before the goblins show up. It's just like, here's a conflict, an interesting conflict that exists, but no, here's goblins, here's the real enemy. They got to be defeated now, and I don't know. It just feels like there's not enough like interesting, like out of this way kind of thought-provoking elements in this story that keep me hooked in the way of like Lord of the Ring. And that's another issue, is I found myself comparing this to the Lord of the Rings series. And I know this came out before, but it's by the same author, so theoretically it should have the same level of juice. Like he should be channeling the same energy that he channeled in any one of the Lord of the Rings series into The Hobbit. And unfortunately, I don't think that Tolkien has successfully managed to do that. This feels like a shadow of the Lord of the Rings series. It's a proto-Lord of the Rings book. He is really building on the ideas that he would fully flesh out in the Lord of the Rings series. And so in that way, it feels kind of unfair to compare it between the two. Or maybe I should have read The Hobbit first before reading the Lord of the Rings series, because then it would have felt like a much stronger progression. But even then, it's clear like there isn't as much effort, or there isn't as much like power in The Hobbit as compared with the Lord of the Rings series. So it might be completely unfair. And it also might be the fact that the target audience wasn't Lord of the Rings fans for The Hobbit, whereas the target audience was probably children. This is meant to be a bedtime story. This is meant to be, a children's tale that they read about, a grand adventure. And perhaps I'm hoping for too much out of the out of the Hobbit. Like I want it to be something that it's not. And so I'm willing to recognize that issue there. Anyway, those are my thoughts on The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien, and it's an okay story. It's fine. I don't really have a connection with it, and I'm probably not going to feel the same way about it in the future that I feel about the Lord of the Rings series. And in fact, this just made me want to read more of the Lord of the Rings series and just return back to the series, because those 3 books, those 6 books actually, really have a kick that I haven't been able to find in many other fantasy type books. And I'm also willing to recognize, this isn't my cup of tea. So I guess I might recommend this to you out there if you want a simple adventure story. If you're looking for something in depth like the Lord of the Rings series, if you're looking for something that has that kick that the first 6 books had, or that the 6 books in that series had, then maybe this isn't for you. But it's a perfectly okay story to read to your children to get them introduced to fantasy. That would be pretty interesting. But yeah, if you read this before, or you simply want to comment on something I said here, do so below. Also, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about the Lord of the Rings series if they do not already know. Also, shout out to my friend Cassie. We did this as a read-along together. She seems to have enjoyed the book a bit more than me, which is always nice. She particularly liked the songs, so that's another perspective right there in the book. But otherwise, I wish you the best of luck on your weird and hobbity travels. Farewell.